Good afternoon, everyone, and morning, depending on where you are across the country. My name is Eric Turcott. I am the president of the Council for Canadian Urbanism. It's a pleasure to be here today, and welcome to our first webinar of the season, the Urbanizing Suburbia in Canada issue trends and perspectives. So it's we're quite delighted to have everyone here today. So first, I would like to begin by, acknowledging that the Indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today, we're virtual. So we want to acknowledge everyone from coast to coast. And we want to take a moment here to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. And we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationship between nations and to improving our own understanding of local, Indigenous, and their culture. Also, what I would like to do is I'd like to wish everyone a happy Black History Month. For 2022, Canada's theme for Black History Month is February and Forever, celebrating Black history today and every day. So we acknowledge and honor the many contributions made by people of African and Caribbean ancestry to Canadian city building. Just a few words about the Council for Canadian Urbanism. We are, our goal is to, to create and to promote better cities through urban design. We're a group of practitioners from coast to coast, in private, in public sector, in the educational sector, and from coast to coast. And we are a group that is interested in in promoting using urban design as a foundation for great city building. So we want to connect people with similar interests. Our goal is to educate, to inform, give support, and to advocate for for better policies, program, investment, anything that helps us to advance better city. And you can reach us at canu.ca or at info@canu.ca, and we do have a fairly active Twitter account at Canadian Urbanism. And then maybe to the next one, please. And then without any further ado, I will pass it to Alex Terenu, a former board member, but the chair of the Urbanizing Suburbia Caucus at the Council for Canadian Urbanism. So Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Eric. In fact, one of the co-chairs. And I wanted to do a very brief overview and a backgrounder of the work that both CanU and the caucus did. From the outset, from as early as 2007, we did presentations on this topic and work on this topic. And then the charter has, hold on a second. The charter has provisions. The charter was, CanU charter was signed in 2013. 2010, Professor David Gordon presented the first draft paper on urbanizing suburbia, and that was updated. The last one is a resource and present on the website, is Mid-Sized Cities. We did a number of presentations at national, at international conferences. In 2014, CanU 6, the summits we used to organize every fall, and we want to go back again to do that, was in GTA, and it was focused almost exclusively on suburban issues. And all our work underlined the importance of the process, the fact that there are key issues, there are specific Canadian aspects, there are demonstration projects, and then it's a really worthwhile exercise. And in 2018, we published an article that's right now on the website, and that triggered significant attention and the formation of the caucus. Next one, please. This is an extract of one of the presentations we did for CNU, I think in Detroit, 2016, the last one. We highlighted the specific trends towards urbanization, such as strong urban structure, mixed-use centers, many of them ahead of the work happening on similar issues in the US. Many of them different, master plan development, transit-oriented development, the retrofit of older conventional suburban developments and infrastructure, and very importantly, the focus on public realm, open space in Canadian context, a lot of government-driven, very different context than US. Next one, please. Showing some of the examples, North York Center started in the 80s, Mississauga Center downtown, Markham Center, and so on. Next one, please. About specific issues, just two examples. Parkway Forest, intensification of high-rise neighborhoods. It's something that you're not going to find in US literature. It's very specific Canadian, more closer to European examples, as well as projects like Mount Pleasant Village, which is the first TOD in Greenfield, and that's moving forward. Then we have a number of examples of specific issues to focus on. Next one, please. The caucus was formed 2018. We had representatives from across the country, from all areas of work, municipal, academic. We always had a close relationship with other caucuses and working groups, the resilience and research that then Liming is leading, events, participation, things like that. We try to share information among ourselves, research, resources, examples. We did presentation at national, international events on our own. We have developed an extensive list of issues and trends, leading to more recently the impact of the pandemic and lessons, and you'll see some of them reflected today. And today is our first caucus public meeting. It's going to be very much follow up the structure of our regular meetings, but with 210 or so participants, and also dealing with the questions from the participants in the second part. And you have here some examples, like René, the co-chair, is in Montreal 2018, doing a presentation and an overview. Next one, please. Then I mentioned here just some of the issues we discussed all along, ranging from revitalizing downtowns in conjunction with suburban development, sustainable mobility, transit-oriented development, social balance, green infrastructure, resilient development. I mentioned lately a lot of discussion about pandemic impact and lessons, but all of this was from from the prism of by design, of the tools, the trends, the tools. How do you deal with this? Why is this important? Part of the first discussion was how you define suburbs. I don't want to go there, but it's a long discussion and debate, but we very much went along with what Professor Gordon was saying in terms of focus on transportation, car-oriented development, a key essential aspect of the suburbs, inner suburbs, outer suburbs. Then we got together colleagues from the caucus, and you have here 4 presenters. You have here also 3 panelists, and you have Catherine Perot as the moderator. And then you have all the bios, if you want, on the website. And then we can go very quickly from this to the presentations themselves. And the first is René St. Croix from North Vancouver, long range community manager. And Catherine, René, please take it over. Next one, please.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm starting off our cross-country discussion today in BC. Next slide, please. So across BC, we're seeing a number of key trends that I'm sure most of you are really familiar with. We have a number of very fast-growing cities and suburbs. Affordability is a top issue across the board in terms of not just housing, but also transportation and food security and other areas. And the concept of affordability is becoming more and more out of reach. We've also seen increasing natural disasters and the need for urgent climate change response. We're seeing the implementation of the prioritizing walking, cycling, and transit. We're seeing a demand for or an increased demand in public engagement, while also seeing an increase in engagement fatigue, particularly as we've moved a lot of our consultation online. We're seeing community well-being as a driver for better urban design. And we're seeing the JEDI approach, justice, equity, diversity, inclusivity, as being elevated within the conversations and really searching for those solutions to address the systemic inequities that are present in our current planning system. Last but not least, the pandemic response has resulted in a complete rethinking of our public spaces and even what we consider public space. And now the real challenge is how do we continue to move that progress forward? Next slide, please. At the provincial level, we're seeing a trend in terms of changes to our public consultation framework and also our development processes. So Bill 26 was recently brought forward, and it now means that there's no public hearings required for rezonings that align with official community plans. So what this means is that this shifts sort of the consultation components of our development process. So as we're now then transforming our development processes into earlier and new ways of engaging with the public on these processes, as well as trying to streamline them, because we're also getting signals from the province that we need to get housing approved faster as we're in this affordability crisis. Next slide, please. At the Metro Vancouver and regional level, we have a new policy framework, essentially. Transport 2050 was recently adopted. The draft Metro 2050 strategy is our regional growth strategy, and it is just in the final throes of working towards being adopted. And we have the climate strategic framework. And between those three, what we're really seeing is this emphasis and the focus on how do we get more public transport, how do we create more affordable housing, how do we manage our growth appropriately, and how do we reduce our emissions all at the same time. Next slide, please. What we're seeing at the city level is that we have a new generation of plans being created, and they're focusing on and emphasizing social equity, housing diversity, prioritizing that walking, biking, and transit, connecting the climate emergency, and building on community health and well-being. So what's really interesting here is that the well-being and equity components are no longer singularly living within traditional social plans. They're becoming the drivers for the transportation plans, the climate plans, the community plans, the citywide plans. We have an emphasis on this new generation of plans that someone like me, as an example, an urban designer and city planner by trade, is leading a social plan, a well-being plan. And this really is working to acknowledge that all of these subject areas are far more integrated, and acknowledging that you can't have one area without the other. You have to have it all working together. Next slide, please. So last but not least, I just wanted to touch on the mall transformation and transit-oriented development across the province, and particularly in the Lower Mainland. We have many, many, many mall sites that are undergoing this transformation. And the Lower Mainland has been a leader in TOD and mall transformation for many years. What's particularly interesting now is that we're seeing them fully built out. We're actually, the construction is happening, we're seeing the results, we're seeing how they're working. And I've worked on several of these sites and transforming these malls and their parking lots into new downtowns, new town centers, new community hubs, depending on the scale. But as an observation, that it's, despite having all the density and the general use of mixing of uses and the high quality urban design that's going into these spaces, many are still scaled to the car because of their suburban context. And so the challenge going forward is really, how do we continue to build that sense of community within these spaces, encourage that localized lifestyle, support those active transportation choices, and fully complete that transformation from mall and parking lot, car-centric development into a much more urban context where you can live your daily life with all of your needs at hand, and have a vibrant community. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
We had some troubles to connect.
Okay, are we connected?
Good.
Apologies for that. Thanks, Renee. That was great. And well, my name is David Down. You've got my bio. I'm the Chief Urban Designer at the City of Calgary and a member of the CanU Urbanizing Suburbia Caucus. I am actually going to turn off my camera for this, just because I've been having some connection issues, and I just want to make sure that my sound doesn't drop out partway through. So I'm going to do that now and then get going. So I'm representing Alberta in this discussion, but I'm going to focus specifically on Calgary, as it's somewhat of an anomaly currently on the Canadian planning and development scene, in that it is seeing trends somewhat different to what is happening elsewhere in Canada, at least in the larger cities. And I think that, you know, Calgary is dealing with all of the challenges that Renee has talked about, or many of the challenges in the other cities that Renee has talked about, the climate resilience challenges, the social challenges, as well as changing approaches to planning and urban design. But Calgary is giving us a unique picture of what happens when an economy stumbles, how the market responds, and how policymakers and development authorities are forced to adjust focus and sometimes make accommodations. So, oh, and by the way, sorry, Edmonton, we'll talk about you next time, but this one's about Calgary specifically. So I'm going to drill down a little bit and get to some case study examples. But although today's discussion's about suburbia, if we could have the second slide, please. Yes, thank you. Oh, no, you were on the first. Go to the second. Thank you. Sorry about that. So today's discussion's about suburbia. But after that 2014 oil shock, virtually all of the what do we do now kind of attention in Calgary has been focused on the downtown core. So I did want to talk about that for a moment before we get to some examples of what's happening outside the core. As the downtown office vacancy rate rapidly reached 30%, work was already underway to reimagine Calgary's economic underpinnings, how this stall in the economy could be turned into a reboot of sorts, and most specifically, what to do with all that empty office space. Out of this came the Greater Downtown Plan and Downtown Strategy, including a downtown incentive program, which offered financial support for the conversion of vacant office space to residential. The first phase of which has garnered enthusiastic development interest and is fully subscribed. So it looks like downtown office conversion is becoming a trend here and will play a role in helping to create a more 24/7 mixed-use character, and at the very least make a positive dent in our famously disproportionately office-centric core. This, along with considerable investment into downtown projects and burgeoning new business interest, gives hope for the vision of a reimagined core. Plus, suddenly, oil prices are up again, so we'll see what happens. But we're here today to focus on what's happening outside the city cores, and our economic struggles have, of course, impacted those areas as well. Next slide, please. Before we talk about some examples of the suburban trends, though, I wanted to talk for just a moment about some of the work that my team, the citywide urban design team, is doing to track changing development behavior. Our quality project sets out to better understand perceptions of quality in urban design and to clarify and communicate City of Calgary definitions and expectations of quality design, with the ultimate objective, of course, of encouraging better outcomes. Through this work, we've collected, evaluated, and analyzed data on development applications based on specific criteria, allowing us to identify and analyze trends. The graphic on the right, for example, shows built form typologies as defined in policy and their average performance over time. Next slide, please. Sorting the data by typology has been particularly interesting and helps us to understand market shifts. The graph on the left shows the change in numbers of development applications within various defined typologies over the last 3 years. Notice the sharp recent declines in the number of development applications within the mixed use and commercial categories in particular. Could we go to slide 5, please? Next slide. So whether the result of changes in developer confidence or changes in consumer preference, these shifts are particularly in evidence at some of Calgary's developing station areas. Many have plans in place. This is Westbrook Village on the left, which looked to future high-density mixed-use cluster around stations, surrounded by high-quality public realm and outdoor amenity spaces. In this case, the plan was approved in 2009, the station opened in 2012, and we were busy with development permit applications when things went awry with oil and gas. The image on the lower center shows how the site still sits vacant today, but we are now seeing revised applications for reduced density and retail use. On the right is the green line route map. Construction of the first phase set to begin this year with 25, eventually, new station locations, all envisioned for potential redevelopment to meet station area planning policies and principles. If current trends are any indication, we may have to adjust our expectations. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. Thanks. This is one example of the changing built form we're seeing more and more of at both existing and future station areas with previously approved plans in place. The approved concept plan images on the left show, as expected, a combination of mixed use, Mid to high density residential focused on a retail main street leading to the station plaza. On the right is one of the development permits submitted for these lands more recently, showing the mid to high rise residential replaced with 2-story townhouses and 4-story blocks, and the main street retail now just 2 CRUs only on the north side. This will likely result in a livable and attractive neighborhood, but it will not meet the expectations of the original concept plan or TOD planning principles. But it is represented to us as what the market will currently support. Next slide, please. Another example, concept plan on the left shows a station plaza at the bottom of the site, or the bottom of the image, with a mixed retail and residential street leading up to a main street style comprehensive retail development. The submitted development permit on the right shows, similar to the previous, much of the retail and higher density residential replaced by 2-story townhouse. Similarly not meeting TOD planning principles, but meeting market demand and, in the words of industry representatives, doing density differently. Next slide, please. Calgary's municipal development plan has an established Main Streets program and clear policy objectives. The map on the left shows the 24 defined Main Street areas, which have seen land use change and ongoing public realm investment. On the right is an interesting case of Main Street commercial where one side of the new Main Street has already been constructed, but the market shift has resulted in uncertainty in the viability of more retail, resulting in a reapplication to pure residential and ultimately a one-sided retail Main Street. We're hoping that this is one instance where the concept of retail ready or main floor residential, which has been pre-designed for future conversion to retail, can be implemented when the market demand arrives. So, although we do continue to see robust densification in established communities within the city, particularly along main streets, in the suburban new communities, we're seeing a market-driven movement away from promises of mixed use and medium to high density, and a reduction in the amount of street-oriented retail, and we're having to adjust our expectations as a result. I feel that this may be quite different from what we're going to be hearing from our other presenters. But of course, as I mentioned at the same time, Alberta's economy is rebounding, and it'll take a few years to dig out, but it remains to be seen whether these current trends are long-lived and will continue, even as the economy improves. So that's my snapshot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. My name is Sharon Mittman, and I'm the manager of urban design in the city of Mississauga. Thank you very much for including Mississauga. It's a great opportunity, and I love hearing what's happening across Canada. It's nice to see that Vancouver is experiencing the same issues with the province and no public consultation that Ontario is now looking to implement as well. So great to hear we're all in the same boat. So I just actually want to introduce Mississauga. This is not the look of Mississauga, but you can go to the next slide, but thank you. Mississauga is the 6th largest city in Canada, and we were originally formed as a bedroom community. So we are predominantly suburb areas, and we have intensification areas within Mississauga. So we have about 7 intensification areas that include downtown, Port Credit, a number of old historical areas within Mississauga. And those are the ones we're really trying to urbanize or focus our urbanization on. We have a number of initiatives in Mississauga. One is the LRT. And this image is actually a picture of what the LRT loop was supposed to be in the downtown, but unfortunately got canceled through the province. But we have a really wide road on that street that would have looked great with a LRT on it. We have a number of initiatives in Mississauga that include the changing lanes. So I'm really going to be focusing on connectivity and how anyone out there right now who's actually still building a bedroom community or a suburban community really needs to focus on connectivity and connecting your roads, connecting your sidewalks, connecting your walkways, making sure pedestrians can actually get somewhere in order to create that 15-minute city, which is now the trend. If you want to move to the next slide, I'm just going to show you a bit of downtown Mississauga. So downtown Mississauga currently has 12 buildings under construction, high-rise buildings. We have 19 more that are going to be starting construction, are just at the end of their approval process. And we have one office tower that is in discussions and in an application form. So we have a significant high-rise development moving into our downtown. We have an unlimited height limit in our downtown. So we have a lot of vertical density as opposed to surface density. So in our horizontal density in our suburbs and vertical density in our downtown urban areas. As I said, we did have an unlimited height, which has recently been capped at about 80 or 79 stories, 80 stories, due to the airport, which is also in our municipality. If you want to move to the next slide. So here's an image of what we would like to achieve. As you saw in the first picture, Mississauga has one advantage of having wider roads, not because they move cars faster, but because we have a large right of way that we can actually transform into a more walkable community. Add more street trees, add more cycling lanes, and actually have a mobility change as opposed to just emphasizing everything on the car. Move it towards cycling and pedestrian and transit. And while we always say we hate our wide roads, and they move traffic fast, we like to say that they're actually an advantage to us at this point when we're transitioning to more of an urban environment, it's fantastic to see. We have a changing lanes program that is actually relooking at our classifications of roads. And we're actually not calling them roads anymore, we're calling them streets. And street is more encompassing to actually having all of the users in the roads. Like I said, pedestrian, cycling, transit, and still leaving a little bit of automobile transit or traffic in there. We're trying to slow down our traffic. We're trying to create a more urban environment. Vision Zero is becoming a huge piece of Mississauga road development. And we're really putting a huge emphasis on the public realm and how to achieve the public realm and walkability in all of our urban areas. And if you want to move to the next slide. Thank you. So here's just a lesson to future municipalities. Connect your roads. So here we have a Trelawney neighborhood where we will probably never be able to achieve the connectivity in a more suburban area. Whereas in a downtown or in a grid pattern, it actually helps your city grow. Your city can't grow if you can't connect roads. And that is the key lesson to learn from anyone. If you can't walk anywhere, if you're not connected, you will really have a challenge. So cul-de-sacs, unfortunately, we were built in the 70s and 80s, but we're really transitioning to a really positive, walkable environment. And grid patterns doesn't have to be straight, doesn't have to be perfect, but just making sure you connect everything within your area, your municipality. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Peter?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You hear me? Okay. So Peter Soland, I'm an urban designer, a landscape architect in Montreal. So I want to share with you a very quick overview of the planning of Laval's new downtown. If you go to the next slide. So we're acting really as design consultants for the city. Our mandate has been finished, but my focus will obviously be from the perspective as a design practitioner. Laval is first and foremost an island made up of an accretion of suburbs, and there's absolutely no downtown there, even if the municipality is the third most populous in Quebec. The city's young, enlightened planners, however, involved in changing this, and so we were happy to be involved in the project. It has been brewing since 2007, with the extension of Montreal's subway network to Laval. So there's now the N line within the perimeter that you see here in white. The new downtown core will cover 8 square kilometers. That's 8 times the size of old Montreal. And over what is today an area that's defined largely by highways and first generation shopping malls. Next slide. So if you go back in history, you'll see this territory is totally virgin of urban infrastructure. 80 years ago, as this aerial view shows, it's only fields. And you can even go back 40 years, 1980s, and it's still just fields, with the exception of the highway running north, connecting Montreal to its summer and winter playground, which are the Laurentians. And there's never even been a crossroad or a village in the perimeter of the projected downtown perimeter. Next slide. So how do you plan a downtown on such scarce historical material? There are a few territorial markers that are present, old country roads that divided the fields, including the undulating Chemin du Très Carré, which you could sort of see on the left diagram, that followed existing topographical conditions. There are also preserved forests and wetlands, an old quarry, and several contemporary landmarks, including the terminal subway, which is situated in the bottom left part of the L-shaped perimeter of the projected downtown. Next. So these were the backbones of the project's initial strategies. One, creating a green infrastructure by connecting the existing forests and creating new green links, especially along the oldest axes. Today, the roadway, the undulating one, is called Boulevard du Souvenir, memory lane, which is either ironic or prophetic. And two, defining distinct neighborhoods and identifying for each of them strong public spaces. And so it's a bit small in the image here, but there's this blue cultural loop in one of the neighborhoods at the bottom, and there's a green interconnecting esplanades shown on the right-hand plan. I'll show these in more detail in a few minutes. Next slide. So each of these defining public spaces become the backbone of new complete neighborhoods with distinct identities and densities within the overall downtown master plan, which you could see here. One of the major territorial interventions is the Metropolitan Park that connects the neighborhoods on either side of the highway, which runs north-south and vertically in the drawing, and wraps around the old quarry, which is illustrated here in blue. Next. And so within the plan, the new neighborhoods lend themselves to huge development opportunities, and we saw a lot of examples in previous presentations, and a huge potential for creating innovative morphologies in terms of layout, heights, density, program distribution, street level animation, and the design of the public realm. In parallel, the city is developing a form-based code to accompany the real estate development, though I have not seen the result of the code itself. And each of the actually defining sort of neighborhoods within the downtown core will have their own sort of density identities. Next slide. The city obviously has a huge challenge downsizing its arterial infrastructure and introducing a full range of smaller scale active mobility infrastructure, including new streets, and hopefully as well, breaking up the large scale grid with mid-block crossings and open blocks, as was shown in the previous slide. So this goes right back to what Sharon was mentioning a minute ago. Next. Coming back to the primary metropolitan plan, it's projected to, Metropolitan Park, it's projected to jump over the highway, as you can see here, and provide a defining mobility and ecological infrastructure. It's called the Coulée du Souvenir, and I've translated it as the biomemory corridor. It's over 1.5 kilometers long, 130 meters wide. You can see how it extends into the old quarry and woodland, where the city envisions a unique and innovative technological park. So that's one of the neighborhoods. We've also imagined the Green Link as a strong biodiversity corridor, part of the larger green belt. It's a huge undertaking, obviously, for the city, since in this case, land must be bought and assembled to create the new park right-of-way. At the right of the screen, you can see two of the new neighborhoods as they're projected to be built out. Next slide. So here's an example of one neighborhood. Strong density, the open blocks built around the defining public esplanades that connect to the green corridor. The blue line represents one of the principal bus lines that extends across the downtown core towards the peripheral communities. And you could also perhaps distinguish the blue bands within the esplanades and that signal the water retention objectives that are built into the design of all the new public spaces. Next slide. And so finally, in this drawing, we can appreciate the Pochet plan. You can appreciate the recognizable grain of what I would call a true urban structure and morphology. as it contrasts with the small grain density of the peripheral suburbs and the large-scale commercial industrial grain at the top of the drawing. It's a huge undertaking. It's planned to extend obviously over the next 20 to 30 years for the city. What's my level of confidence when I hear some of the previous presentations? 50-50, you know, because obviously the city will be in strong discussion with each of the private landowners of the shopping malls, because it's basically mall transformation on a, you know, at a large scale. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Merci, Peter. And now we go into thank you very much to the presenters. Now we go into the panelist discussion. For that purpose, we've been joined by Ronji Baroa, the city architect and head of urban design from Markham and member of the caucus, by our colleague Dan Leeming, who is also founder of CanU and member of the caucus, and lead of the Resilience Caucus, founder of Planning Partnership in Toronto, as well as myself, and by our member, as I mentioned, Catherine Perrault, who's gonna moderate this. I wanted to say from the outset, we've been set up to answer the questions that were addressed through the registration process. There's plenty of them, as opposed to the Q&As. But anyway, Catherine, take it over.
Okay, first of all, thank you everybody for your presentations, and thank you to the registrants for submitting such thoughtful questions in advance. As Alex mentioned, we've gone through them and grouped them by theme and selected one or two that are representative of various topics that we addressed today. So I'm going to direct the questions to different panelists, but by all means, please jump in and add your perspective afterwards. So I think that one of the good places to start here, which picks up some threads from the presentations given, is about the challenge of the car-oriented suburbs. So we have a question here asking to please address the impact of auto-oriented development, and how well are your communities moving towards walkable or complete or 15-minute style communities, and what are some of the challenges and what are some of the practical things that you think should be done. So Sharon and Peter, I know you addressed this, so this gives a chance for others to jump in, but also Sharon and Peter, if you'd like to provide a few more details about what you've noticed in Laval and Mississauga, that would be fantastic as well. So Sharon, do you want to kick this one off? Okay, thanks.
I can start. So a city does look completely different when it's designed around the automobile. I mean, obviously the roads are much wider, the speeds are higher, but as we're moving towards a more urban environment, and as I spoke to the Changing Lanes program that we're actually moving in place, where we're renaming our roads to streets, we're rebalancing, because we really need to look at what more transit use, getting more people into one particular area. So, and re-emphasizing the balance between pedestrians and vehicles and cycling. We have a number of cycling lanes going in the last 2 years, and not only because of COVID, they were actually pre-planned, but moved up in the process because of COVID. And walkability. Walkability is becoming huge in the downtown and huge in the suburbs, just connecting pieces. So while we, as I said before, while we think that roads, we don't love our wide roads, they've provided an excellent opportunity for us to reimagine them in such a great space and really emphasize the pedestrian and transit in those locations.
Maybe.
Yeah, perhaps just one thing at a different level that I noticed in Laval and in Montreal, it's happening as well, is municipalities are getting rid of parking requirements for high density development. So I don't know if that's happening through the country, but that's going to have a big impact, because to go from 2 parking stalls per condominium to 0.5, it enables the redevelopment of the public realm in a whole different fashion. So those are positive steps.
Yeah, we see a reduction as well in parking, almost half from what it was probably 20 years ago. And it's important to keep the balance, like reducing it down to nothing. You have to do it in stages, right? Otherwise, it all falls apart. So we're working towards that as well.
Maybe I'll just add that through the pandemic, one of the really interesting things was to see the nimbleness, how quickly people pivoted and we changed some of our street networks and made the adjustments to do, as you're saying, Sharon, with the rebalancing. And we were able to do it quickly and very, and then you're able to test it. It's a pilot, and then you realize the success, and people love the space. And now it's about transitioning to the more permanent versions of those street networks and making those kind of consistent applications of changing over and rebalancing some of our spaces and reconnecting some of the areas that need to do so.
And maybe I could jump in for a moment too from the Alberta perspective, because Calgary and Edmonton, Alberta generally, I mean, we are known for car-focused cities, developed extensively at the time when the car was king, but we are certainly reevaluating all of that. And we can do that. We're still designing and developing new communities on the periphery. We can do that within those new communities, but the real challenge is how do we retrofit the existing communities built in the 50s to the 70s, 80s. And as Renee mentions, it's that connectivity piece. So it's great to develop the connectivity within the new communities, but we really need to work hard to connect them into the existing communities and then reimagine those streets within those existing communities that didn't imagine pedestrian or cycle continuity and connectivity when they were built. So it's something we're working on. It is a huge challenge.
Let's go to Dan.
I think to a certain extent, there's some societal change that's going to help us out a little bit here on the car dependency. One is owning a car is very expensive. It's about $12,000 a year on average. A lot of young people have delayed getting their driver's license, more so than at any time since the Second World War. The need, if you can get around, if you've got decent transit, you can ride your bike or you can walk. Priorities with a number of younger people is not getting into the car like the baby boomers. It's making sure they can pay for the smartphone monthly payments as they come up. So the adoration of the automobile isn't quite what it used to be. It's incredibly expensive. And there are other ways of meeting up with your friends. You don't need to get in the car to go meet up with them. You can do it on your smartphone, or you can walk, or you can ride your bike. So there is that trend that is also in play right now, which can start it, but you got to deliver on the transit and walkability.
Yeah, for sure. Different ways of connecting and broadening that understanding of connection is really important, Dan. Alex, I see that you have a comment.
Yeah, I wanted to share a bit of the Brampton's experience because very much car oriented, car was king. Bramalea was the new town that Dan worked a while ago, built for cars, designed for cars, planned for cars, but then build it and they'll come. Then we started in a very simple way, the kind of BRT light 2009, and then out of that expanded, and the ridership and the model split went from 3% to 6% and then to 9%. And that was further developed by the regional, by the Go Transit in 2015. Now the LRT that connects with Mississauga is being built, and new BRT on Queen Street is being planned, and further Go expansion. And we saw that we plan full neighborhoods where you can live with just one car or maybe even without a car. And the transit expanded as the neighborhood developed. Then it's possible, but you need to advance this. And then for a while, we need to live with low ridership, right? And then to subsidize that.
Ranji, can you speak to this from the Markham perspective?
I certainly can. Hello, everyone. Apologies for not getting onto the screen, but the story for me is really captured in our title, Urbanizing Suburbia. And the issue is that we have suburbs, places like Markham and perhaps even Brampton were really designed in the early days as commuter suburbs, bedroom communities to serve downtown. And that model of transit, higher order rapid transit that you see today still attests to the model of transportation that feeds everybody downtown. At the same time, what has happened is that growth of the economy and the offices and jobs are spreading throughout the 905 region, which is the Greater Toronto area, and there's no connection across for people to get to each other. And I think Sharon is absolutely right in saying that where we can concentrate on walkability and complete communities and complete streets is really in those intensification areas, whether it's a downtown or a new secondary plan area that's concentrated around transit stops, whether it's a GO line or a new subway line or anything else like that. And that's what we're seeing in Markham, where the new the new subway extension from Finch up to Steeles and then all the way up to Richmond Hill will offer opportunities for people to be able to have a much more walkable community. Same thing is happening with Markham downtown, where the Unionville GO station is part of a better sort of expansion of Metrolinx to have all-day two-way service and make it much more of a 15-minute service than the usual old commuter route where the trains run at rush hour one way in the morning and the other way in the evening. So all those things combined really make those areas the ones that we can have walkable communities and less dependence on cars. But the rest of it is so low density that there is no opportunity, I don't think, in the future, certainly in the near future, for transit. And the problem that we have, again, in Ontario and in places like Markham and Brampton, and Mississauga as well, is that the transit system is run by the region. Local municipalities have no control over it. And then more and more, the province is getting into the transit game. And so the issues that affect us are not in our control. I think I better stop there. There are many more things we can say, but I think that really is the Markham experience right now. We're changing, but there's a huge gap between where people live in low density areas and where they work, which is all across the GTA, and the ability to provide the 15-minute community.
Okay, thank you, Ranji. Renee, did you have another comment on this topic?
Yeah, I'll just build on Ranji's for a minute there in the sense that we have a number of these, like I mentioned, the mall transformations. And so you have these islands of walkable paradise, let's call them. And then how do you connect between those areas? And the peripheries are still car oriented. So the challenge becomes making sure that you have those transit options available for those longer trips and when you want to go between. And I think we're seeing that in particular in the Lower Mainland. We're fortunate in that we have SkyTrain and some of these other like rapid transit and such. But as these different communities start to build out, creating that connection between them and other mobility choices is also key, other than just having those kind of singular little islands of walkability and such. So we have to continue to build on that as we move outwards.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the transit as well. There were several questions submitted about the cost of transit, the political challenges of extending transit into the suburbs. And there was one really interesting question using the language of catalyst. And so I will put this to everybody as well in terms of what comes first, density or transit, and what is the right catalyst for creating more urban suburban environments. And I know Sharon already mentioned kind of that it has to kind of go incrementally or it can all fall apart. She mentioned that earlier. But Sharon, do you want to expand on that first?
Sure. It's not, like I said, it's not one thing that starts and then you build a community after you put transit in place. That's really not economical. And I'm not sure any municipality can actually afford to do that without the density base. But it's an iterative process. So you build some density, you put some buses in, then you build some more density, then you put an LRT, and then you put some more density, and you put a subway in. But you really need to plan for it. It's the big thing, right? You can't just iteratively put it in. You need to have a long-term plan and what your long-term goal and how many people you're going you're anticipating happening. So it's about putting the plan in place, and it's about doing those plans along the way, not just talking about the plan for years. It's actually about putting those pieces in place while you build.
Ranji, can you speak to this one as well? Oh, you'll have to, yeah.
Sorry, I just had to take a phone call. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry,
Oh, so the question is just picking up on we talked about kind of the structuring elements of the transportation systems in the suburbs. Now we're moving into a discussion about transit. So the question was, what comes first, transit or density? What's the appropriate catalyst? So maybe while you're thinking about that, I'll go to Dan.
No, I can talk about that in a different way.
Okay.
And the question is, if we can consider transit as a generator of economic growth and put a different lens on it, then higher levels of government should be able to recognize that cities actually are the economic engines of the country now. It's no longer farming, it's no longer the exurvia, it's no longer this, it's no longer that. It's not manufacturing anymore in Canada. So to put in money into providing transit, a really good transit network in a community, is the best way to get stuff going. So in a way, you need to have a transit plan and a planning development plan that go together. And so there has to be integration between the two, between the different levels of government. For example, just a very quick example, the transit system in Paris is run by SNCF, which is their national rail network. 50% of the profit for SNCF comes from the Paris system. And so it's a synergy between different levels of government and an integrated approach that allows corporations and public sector organizations to work together to give you a better solution for modal split and growth. And so in our case, we just live in these isolated silos. And again, I'm just barking into the wind, but you can see where I am with this. That for example, in Markham, we're planning our intensification areas, as I call them, along Highway 7, which is a transit route. And in the future, at some point, we'll have much more transit. But if the transit runs every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes, it's not as useful. And if there's no cross connections north and south from this east-west route, again, it's not useful. So transit has to be taken out of the hands of just the transit guys, but somehow have a much more integrated relationship between transportation and land use and economy to get a better understanding of how city works.
Thank you for those comments. I think that Renee would be a good person to pick that up, because you were talking about kind of how you're seeing a lot more integration in the communities in the Lower Mainland. Maybe you can pick up on that thread there.
Yeah, just so starting at the regional level, the regional strategy and the Transport 2050 regional transportation plan were done hand in hand. And then we're also seeing what's really interesting is that we're seeing both. So whether you're asking if the density versus the transit is the catalyst, in some cases, the transit is the catalyst. It's been put in place, it's been there for years. And now we're seeing those communities around those transit stations finally starting to develop. In other cases, what we're seeing is municipalities are putting in place the land use and the framework to then entice the development of transport options. And so we've got both sides of it, and it's all what's happening now is a much better integration of those concepts and determining, 50 years out, what does the transport look like, such that you're actually building in the space, you're building in those relationships, and you're really connecting the dots between how livable that community will be and how accessible it is in a region where there's a lot of people who go back and forth to different areas all the time, particularly around our affordability challenges. So when you're asking which one's the catalyst, both are. It really does, but they have to go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you. Dan.
Just picking up on what Sharon was saying, and I'll keep this short, of the progression of different transit forms. clearly you're not going to get any transit till you have density, at least higher operational transit. The important thing I learned in designing various communities is if you can't deliver even a local bus within a very short period of time after someone moves into a suburban home, they're going to buy a second car or a third car. And once they make that investment, they're not going to give up on it for a long time unless transit gets really good. And I would give another example on the delay of transit. This ties in with what Ranji was saying. Another design project I worked on, very progressive developer, design took through a very difficult approval process. Exactly what the municipality want was an urban nodal area at a key point in a suburban community. As we went through the process, and we were very close, we finally got all the approvals, but we then began to realize, and we're told by regional transit, well, you know what? Transit really won't be here for another 7 years. And all of a sudden, the entire plan of providing a mixed-use nodal area, townhouses, 6-story, 8-story, 16-story buildings started to fall apart because you don't have transit, they would have to build a second garage because the people in this area, usually to work, they got to get around. And a second garage in a condo situation is another $40,000 to $50,000 to $60,000. When you put that into a mortgage and you start to figure it out, people figured it out very quickly. I'm going to buy a townhouse for the same amount of money I was going to buy a 2-bedroom condo with 2 parking spaces. It was the same mortgage. So the entire project, through a long, difficult process, delivering on what the municipality wanted, was put on the shelf for at least 5 years. So there's these reciprocal relationships you have to keep looking at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. David, do you want to follow up on that?
I'll follow up on that a little bit. My follow-up is a little bit more in adding on to what Renee was saying, but this question of density in transit, it really is an iterative process. It goes hand in hand. And the difficult question for mid-sized cities, I'll say, and what's been going on in Calgary is when do you make that jump to the next order of transit? I think in Calgary, we made that jump to the next order to the light rail transit in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. And that was well in advance of having the density to really generate interest in redeveloping around those stations. And in fact, that interest didn't start coming until the current decade, and again was stymied, I would say, by the economic shift. So I think we all have to go into these things with eyes wide open. We're getting into a new line now, the Green Line, as I said, 25 new stations. We don't anticipate that station area redevelopment will occur instantly, but we're doing a lot of planning to be prepared for it when it comes. It's taken 40 years for the initial lines. How long will it take? These projects are 50, 60, 100-year visions for city, but it is a difficult question. Is a BRT the right choice to make for the time being, or maybe even for the future, or do you make that jump to that next and much more expensive level of transit?
Okay, thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to, from the perspective of Laval, from hearing some of the planners there, I think there's 2 things. One is the, and I think Dan touched on this. There are new trends in living. You know, people in Laval, people are tired of transiting from Laval to Montreal, its core downtown. So they want to live in a new type of neighborhood, and so there's a demand for sort of nodal communities within the Laval Island. And so I think that's one of the drivers. The challenge is to make sure that these, TODs or, these new communities, they're real full communities, and they're not just towers of condominiums, that are linked to a subway or a light rail. And so that's where the importance of the public realm and the public space and the programming of ground floors so that these, people could, it's not just a density, it's actually, an agreeable place to live. And so that's, I think that's the challenge. And so it's not so much then, is it, what's going to be the proper catalyst or how they come, but to make sure that these communities are places people can spend time in, that they connect to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to this question of good suburban urban design for creating those kinds of places. But Sharon, I see your hand. Did you want to give another point on the point of transportation first?
I just wanted to add one thing. One of the things that we really saw when we actually planned our LRT on Hurontario Street was we had originally planned it for mid-rise built form and to complement with mixed use along Hurontario Street. And one of the things we saw was developers immediately said, higher order transit, let's do a 40 to 50 story building. And that was their response to higher order transit. So I think when you plan, you need to plan densities and height when you look at higher order transit. It can't just be a specific higher order transit that doesn't transform into the land use that's adjacent to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That relationship is integral. So I want to just shift back to what Peter was talking about in terms of having a good urban form, pleasant places to live. What are some examples of great urban public spaces in the suburbs? And we're talking quite a bit about mall redevelopments. I know Renee and Peter, you mentioned them both in your presentations. I'm curious to know where the land was given over in a public way, either through a covenant, or was it deeded back to the city, or was it retained in terms of the private ownership and was essentially a publicly accessible private space? I wonder if you can speak a bit about what are some of the strongest urban design strategies you've witnessed, whether there's a difference between urban and suburban design in any of that, and then also about the public access. So let's Peter, maybe since you were just talking about this, maybe you can pick that up. And I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about that, the bridge, the ecological memory bridge. I mean, if you want to give a little bit more details about that, because that was really interesting.
Okay, those are two subjects quite different, but yeah, but I mean, that's probably one thing that will define new trends, is that we often think of public space as as commercially, accessible and mineral for events and gatherings. But to think of public space in a sort of ecological perspective as large-scale accessible green infrastructure, I think in a suburban context, that's probably something to think about, because it's defining public space at a territorial or regional scale rather than as an urban scale, and that might be more accessible to sort of bedroom communities where there are perhaps still regional territories at the edges, but to think of public space in a different way for those type of environments will probably be a one way to go. So that for us, that sort of ecological bridge was as a defining public space, not so much as much as it is an ecological system, and to bring it to the scale of the highway and say this is as important as transportation is one way of affirming the importance of such a piece of city making. To come back to the other question, we were asked by developers after the proposal that I presented, one of these shopping malls are obviously owned by private developers, and they want to get into the mall transformation business, and it's a challenge because they're not thinking urban, they don't have an urban reference. They're thinking density, they're thinking number of condominiums they can sell, and they're getting the idea that they have to put maybe a gym or some type of small marketplace at the bottom of the ground floor, but they're coming from a very far place in terms of urban thinking and what makes up a public space. So that's the education of these large landowners is gonna is a big a big challenge.
Okay. Good design in the suburbs, Renee.
Yeah, it's what we're seeing is actually some pretty incredible public spaces being designed, and they have this incredible quality to them. And what's interesting on some of these mall sites is that the public space is being retained by the landowner, but through easements and other forms and covenants and such, we're able to make sure that those are publicly accessible. But by virtue of them retaining ownership, they're able to maintain that high quality. They're able to do additional programming to make them, whether it's dance shows on their on a theater stage, or public fountains that are have lights and different displays and these types of things, or other activities. Again, through the pandemic, we saw lots of classes move outside. So there was, pedal bike classes in the middle of a plaza. These types of things, that programming that brings life to these public spaces, particularly when they're new and they haven't reached that kind of body heat, that density of people yet, it's making them a place to be. So we're seeing that the enhanced design of these spaces and the quality that's going into them in terms of materials and just thoughtfulness is really increasing the desire to be there, as well as kind of trying to form that connectivity among residents and visitors alike. So we're seeing that kind of definition in those public spaces. In other cases, we're seeing the public spaces being handed over to the city or to the municipality, and then they take over, and we have dedicated public space, which is also fantastic. And it means that those places can't be cut off necessarily for private events and some of those types of things. So it's we're seeing a balance depending on the municipality. It also relates back to cost and maintenance over time. So when the landowner retains ownership, they also bear the burden of the costs and some of these kind of components around maintenance and that kind of thing. It enables a different level of maintenance and quality standards. The last piece I'll say is that with the malls, one of the other key components is that on these sites, they're turning the mall inside out, right? So we now have these retail streets, these kind of urban feeling spaces that are happening in the suburbs, which is also quite a different experience related to the kind of neighborhoods and what they used to have, which was, again, the mall and the sea of parking. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Renee. Ranji, do you have some comments here about public spaces and good urban design in the suburbs?
I'll make it very short. Thank you very much, Catherine. What I was going to say is that in places like Markham, which is starting to urbanize, we don't have the spaces yet until we build a high density mixed use areas in our intensification areas, whether it's Markham Center or somewhere else. And so we're still waiting for that. That's the next wave that's going to happen. But one comment I will make about POPs is that we have found that when it's a commercial space, the landlord is absolutely interested in making sure that any open space is good and welcoming and well-maintained and of a high quality, because that attracts tenants. And that applies, let's say, to office buildings and so on. When I see condos, they don't want other people to use their lands, and they don't want to spend their money to look after other people walking in there. So I would recommend against allowing condos to give us POPs as opposed to giving us public parks. But I would appreciate getting more support for POPs for commercial employment and office developments. I don't know if others have any more experience in this, but that's been our experience.
Okay, Alex?
Well, I live probably, I know Sharon has a lot of experience in Mississauga, and in fact, we can learn from that. But just to mention something about design excellence, because there was a session organized not that long ago, Urban Design Awards in Mississauga, and I noticed this trend the last, I would say, 10, 15, 20 years. There was a lot of good design, architectural first, I would say, going into landscape and then ending with place making, which is the urban design puts it together. then there are great projects across the country in this kind of context, recognized at National Urban Design Awards and others. And there's also some trends in terms of intensifying old suburban parks. That suburban parks were quite generally think about, I don't know, in Bramley and many other places, open fields, activities 3 months a year and all that, and to try to intensify them and to try to make them more urban. The other thing was the access to nature, which is a fundamental part of that. Things like daylighting of water courses. We need water, we need that element. And I think Peter had some great examples about that. But also these very typical main streets and urban squares, very typical urban features that are coming in the suburbs as well. And we had a lot of experience with that in Mount Pleasant Village as an example, little 3 acres, 1 hectare or something like that square, that became the place for the market, became the catalyst for the place itself.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Sharon?
So I just wanted to bring up another thing which we struggle with in Mississauga is parkland. And it's actually getting parkland in our more urban areas. Land values are so astronomically high now, we can't purchase them outright. So that's a challenge. Developers are very apprehensive about providing cash, not cash in lieu, but actually land, because they've paid an exorbitant amount of land or value. So actually getting the parks and the spaces within our downtown is more challenging than actually getting the details right now. And the same thing for our public realm. Like we have a lot of applications where they don't want to provide a good public realm. And that's a huge challenge for us, for a municipality that won't be able to afford to do that, particularly after COVID, where we've all been pretty well almost bankrupt. So leaving a legacy for a municipality with no money is really challenging. If we don't get these things through the development, we're not getting them. And then we can't spend time on the details. So that's a huge challenge, I know, for Mississauga, and I would suspect for anyone else in Ontario and probably across Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody want to follow up on that?
Get it while you can, because Sharon mentioned already, you have the right of ways, they're wide, they're huge, but you can convert them. As they say, you get the parks and the parkland dedication early on, you can use it later. The other way, you end up with situations like, let's say, Toronto downtown, and you have to use $1 billion, but the $1 billion is not from DCs. It's only tax-based or other form of grants. Then if you don't do it early, it's very then to try to have the flexibility of land use in many instances. It's much harder to go. It's also much more expensive because, as an example, in Brampton, there were some large 100-acre parks being bought at $180,000 per acre 25 years ago. And now the same thing is probably 10 times more expensive. And it's impossible to assemble, to put it together.
Mm-hmm. I think, oh, sorry, David, would you like to follow up on this point? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, muted again. Just very quickly, I think we all struggle with this issue of the cost of land and assembling large parcels. And further to what Sharon was saying, I think that on a development by development incremental basis, it's really important to establish a strategy which covers an entire area or an entire street. And sometimes we can only achieve a linear outcome, which is a really great public realm, maybe with land that's borrowed or bonused away from development sites. But it's those linear places that encourage the pedestrian activity or increase cycle activity that I think have to take the place of some of the parkland that we're missing, particularly in already developed neighborhoods where we can't afford to assemble large parcels of already occupied land. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Peter?
I just follow on that, the Laval project, that huge ecological corridor. The city, I got the confirmation that they're working on it, but it is, it does mean assembling large parcels from taking them away from the commercial properties. And obviously it's a give and take. So I'm not sure what they're getting, either giving in exchange. Definitely density, but there it is a linear piece and it's sort of carving off on either side making sure that you can create such a public infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. We had several questions from registrants about consulting with the public and sort of NIMBYism and resistance to densification or changes to extend transit, et cetera. And also developers, and there was even a question about planners who were reticent to change. So I wonder if we could go first to Dan to think about, you know, what kind of practical advice or what sort of insights do you have from your planning experience around consultation or negotiation with developers or planners or other practitioners or even council members for that matter, just in terms of shaping a vision for urbanizing or densifying various parcels that you've worked on?
Having worked for both municipalities and private builders, developers, first of all, you need to share and understand everyone's perspective on how people want to live and what it does it take to get something built. I always found in public consultation, it really needs to be consultation. It needs to be, that's why urban design sessions are so good, where you draw up the plan with 6 to 10 people around a table and many tables of as many people want to come. And you start to talk about what is your priority, where do you live, how does this work? And I find often it's a very simple discussion on what people look for. And it's interesting if someone said, no, I don't want anything more than 3 stories around my house. I always ask the question, where do you want to live later on when you don't want to shovel snow? You may want to go south for a little bit. You don't want to pay heavy taxes on your single family home. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to be next to a community where your kids could visit your grandparents, where you could change your housing form as you needed it and realize some capital you may have earned in that house to do other things in your life. And the conversation starts to become, this is how I would like, yeah, you know what, I hadn't thought of that. You know, and they say, where are your kids going to live? They can't afford your house unless you're going to leave it to them, but they got to struggle. And wouldn't it be nice to be in a community or next to a community where life cycle housing, your kids could afford to rent initially. They can move up, you know, they can get a part of a condo or a townhouse. When they start to have kids and they want a bigger family and they can manage it, they can move to a larger housing form. And you're still in the same area. You still keep the same friends, you keep the same family, same social, cultural, religious groups. And then on things, you know, again, people start to think about that in a certain perspective. And some people say they only think about tomorrow and they're going to walk away. But I find more times than not, the conversation carries on and they start asking questions. And one of them will be height. And I say, well, you know, a 4-story building really allows for a lot of diversity. And it's not even the height of a tree. A mature tree is about 60 feet, 70 feet. So it's not that intrusive that you can introduce a high rise or mid rise, actually low rise, depending how you look at it, into a community and provide that. So for me, it's almost like having a discussion with people on climate change. Is you got to talk to people on a very simple and personal level of how do they want to live? Have they considered this or that? They do have choices. There are other people in their lives that they need to think about. And I found that that's very helpful. And of course, at a design charrette, you're sketching as you talk and you can illustrate different ideas, but it's bringing it down to a level that it's not a talking head, someone telling people this is the policy and this was decided a long time ago and so on. That generally doesn't work. That tends to fire people up. So anyway, that's more my approach.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have comments to respond to the registrant questions about consultations and negotiating with developers? Let's go to Renee.
Yeah, I think this is one of those ones where it's both as simple and as complicated as transparency and expectation management. There's a significant need that when we do consultation, we do the right kinds of consultation and share what is on the table, what is off the table, have that form discussion, the discussion of trade-offs. You know, there are certain expectations on both sides of the table from the developers in terms of what they can or can't do under the land use plans. And there's expectations from the community in terms of their vision for their neighborhoods. And so we have to be, there has to be a balance of both considerations, but also an understanding of where the conversation can go. And sort of too often when we're doing consultation, we offer these big blue sky things and then say, by the way, we have all these rules and we can't actually do any of that, which not only heightens expectations and drives people into getting really upset and anxious about it. Change is hard. And so we have to do a better way of when we're consulting, we're not just reaching out in a perfunctory way, we're doing it in a way that has an education component, a conversation component, hear that we're listening, as well as saying, you know, well, I hear you, there are these other challenges that we have to address. So what else would you propose? And trying to really make it much more of a dialogue. The other piece I'll put in here is the really reaching out and focusing on the marginalized groups. There are many systemic inequities in our consultation process in terms of access and timing and information that we need to do better at making sure that these groups are actually fully involved. We hear too often from the same voices, and we need that diversity, that inclusion to really be able to actually get there in terms of proper community consultation.
Thank you, Renee. Sharon?
I was actually just going to build on Renee. The same thing. It's about information. It's about sharing, being open and honest with the community, and not say, you know, if you want a walkable community with retail focused community, you need the density to support that. You have to have behind that or close to that, within walking distance, a density that's higher than just 2 to 4 stories. And that information doesn't seem to get to the community, and whether we as municipalities hold more information in how you get those pieces, maybe we can work better on. One thing COVID did do is actually engage a whole set of different people than we actually used to engage. Which, you know, in some aspects has been amazing. So, you know, where we used to get that one population that showed up to every community meeting that because they had time, we now get the people who turn their computer on while they're feeding their families and listen to what's happening and actually have an input. So that's been one really great aspect. And so we need to figure out a way to continue engaging that population.
Yeah, thank you. Alex?
I just thought a little bit about I think you always have to show public benefits in a broad way, particularly because it's much easier to do greenfield, to do it right for the first time, but it's much more challenging to do the retrofit. Some places are, Sharon shows some street retrofit is impossible, right? Traffic infiltration is always a big thing, but you need to show the benefits, and you need to use that in terms of educating. You need to be consistent at that, from the official plan level all the way down to particular applications. I want to mention a little bit something called SNAP, which is Sustainable Neighborhood Action Plan. What happens here in the GTA, we did a lot of work with Toronto Region Conservation. It was great to talk to the local residents in a broader way about sustainability, and it was a great way to educate. We walk streets. The first take was, oh, you want to narrow the street, it's going to be more traffic, put a stoplights. Then say, can you really cross the street? It was also possible to really engage and work together with, tenants, with, poor people in the area, with a very diverse community, to think about the environment, to think about, and also to understand that development can bring funding for this, can improve things. We can use properly the development process to improve their lives. They need to look at that. It's much easier to also discuss this at the official plan level. It's abstract, but it comes in, oh, that's great, but not in my backyard, right? Then you need to expand the palette. And I always think that urban design, showing images, showing examples, it's one of the key tools that can bring people together.
Thanks, Alex. Ranji?
Very quickly again, thanks, Catherine. We have found a difference between dealing with individual applications and dealing with a secondary plan. The reason I'll say that is when we come down with when we prepare a secondary plan, the process allows all the people in the surrounding area to get involved. And it really becomes an issue about transition between the intensification area and the surrounding low density residential areas. But once you establish that, then individual applications within the secondary plan area do not face the same kind of NIMBYism. Unlike, let's say, when a developer comes into an area that is not part of a planned development area, and they come in with high density next to adjacent low density residential, that's where NIMBYism really kicks in, and that's where it's much harder for the city and for the developer to try and convince the residents that they should have this project right there instead of in an area where growth has been planned and allocated by the municipality. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We only have a few minutes left. I want to give an opportunity if there's one of the panelists or any of the panelists who have a final comment you'd like to make to build on something you addressed or to respond to something else just in the final couple minutes here. Dan, I see your hand, thanks. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. And I appreciate we're almost out of time, but one of the huge issues with the suburban areas and growing suburban areas is the whole climate change issue. And I would only raise that 6 out of 10 Canadians are saying climate change is the biggest global issue we've got. And recent polls that CanU did, climate change was rated as one of the biggest issues. In the suburbs, 34% of greenhouse gas emissions are transportation, and over 40% are buildings. That's 74% of greenhouse gas equations. And in suburban areas, you've got low density, detached buildings, high car dependency. That's a big rock to push up the hill. And I would only add, you know, over 500 municipalities have declared a climate change emergency. So what I would ask them, what is your plan? What's your policy? What is your strategic plan? Do you have green sustainable guidelines? Are there real metrics? Can they be ramped up every 3 or 4 years? Because we've got a long way to go to hit Paris. So anyway, there's a number of things that can be done, but suburban areas really do have a challenge in that in the climate change game, and that needs to be done. That could almost be another topic, but I'll just leave it there. Thanks, Catherine.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your presentations, and I thank all the attendants for being here and participating in this important topic. Do Alex or Eric or anybody have a final comment?
Yes, I want to thank everyone. I think that maybe one last note that I may have, like great conversation. I think it's always lovely to hear from coast to coast. Everyone has similar issue, but they're all very different because they are all like dealing with different you know, politics, market forces. One thing I maybe want to add that wasn't really touched was what we see in a lot of what used to be very exclusive to large municipalities. Now a lot of the suburban municipalities are adopting DRP, design review panels, which are also one of the tools that I found that have been really pushing to ensure the right type of integration, you know, ground condition, right type of density. So density done well. So that's something that we see as a trend everywhere in across the country. And I think one of the key aspects is to make sure politicians and staff listen to them, because it is one of the layers. So again, I want to thank all our panelists. Renee, David, Sharon, Catherine, Peter, Ranji, Dan, and Alex for a great session. We have a lot more questions. We had great participation, and I think we'll be looking to in the near future to have a follow-up to this discussion, because I think we've only scratched the surface. So again, thank you everyone, and we hope to see you soon.